morning, everyone. As Marcus said, my name is Amanda, and it is lovely to be with you here today. And hello if you are watching online as well. Now, in 2023, I discovered the existence of something new and exciting, something I'd never heard of before, and that was a Munro. And a Munro is a Scottish mountain, and you are probably all a lot more intelligent than I am and had already heard of Munros, but I had never heard of Munros. And there are 283 Munros in Scotland. Each has an elevation of at least 3,000 feet, which is 914 metres. To put that in perspective, the Shard is just over 1,000 feet. So that is the minimum height of 3 shards, or 18.5 Olympic swimming pools. I can proudly say that I have climbed 1 Munro. Bring on the other 282. Mount Everest, to put it in even more perspective, is 8,849 metres high. That is roughly 29 shards high, which might be a bit beyond me. But people have long had a fascination with mountains. Long before the Reverend Mother exhorted Maria to climb every mountain and ford every stream, people have been searching for something up mountains. People have been meeting with the Lord. In the beginning of the Bible, in Genesis 22, Father Abraham climbs Mount Moriah with his one and only son, and there meets with the angel of the Lord. In Exodus, Moses climbs Mount Sinai, and he descends with a face that is glowing and shining from having spent time with the Lord. The prophet Elijah meets with the Lord, not in the earthquake, the wind, or the fire, but in a still, small voice on the top of Mount Horeb. The Bible bears witness to the fact that God meets you on the mountain. God meets you on the mountain. And that is exactly what happens in our passage in Mark 9. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, his best friends, on this little trip up a mountain. And in Luke's gospel, he says that they went there to pray. So Jesus has set apart this time, this people, on this place for an encounter with God. And that is what happens. In verse 2, if you have a look at your Bible, it says, "There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them, whiter even than your best laundry detergent. And Elijah and Moses appear as well." There's this kind of vision beyond the ordinary. This is a mountaintop experience. And you've got to love the response of Peter, right? He freaks out. Typically, he just says the first thing that comes into his head. He doesn't know what he's saying. He starts talking about tents and shelters. And it's kind of the way that I imagine that you would behave if someone really famous came into your workplace. Or maybe if Wayne Rooney watched last week's service, came into parish coffee and said, "Andy, I want you to pray for me." Would this be the moment that Andy would lose his cool? I don't know. But this is a standout moment. That mountaintop experience is a life-changing encounter. And we know that it is a life-changing encounter for Peter because Peter writes about it. It becomes the basis of his authority as an apostle. Later on in the New Testament, when he is encouraging the persecuted early church, he says this. He says, "We were eyewitnesses of his majesty. He, Jesus, received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory, saying, 'This is my Son, whom I love.' We ourselves heard this voice that came from heaven when we were with him on the sacred mountain." 2 Peter 1:16-21. It's not just any mountain. This is a sacred mountain, a mountain marked by the presence of God who meets us on the mountain. This was a life-changing encounter. And I wonder how many of us can say that we've had that kind of mountaintop experience. That life-changing encounter with God, when you've opened your eyes and realized suddenly that God was in this place, but I hadn't known it. When I was 17 years old, I was dragged, kicking and screaming, quite literally, by my mother to a Christian summer camp. I didn't want to go. I didn't know anyone. I didn't like it. I wanted to leave. And by halfway through the week, I said to my mum, I'm leaving. And she was kind of, okay, fine. It's the evening. I'll put you on a train tomorrow morning, but can you just pretend to smile for one more night? And I was like, yeah, fine, whatever. And that night, there was an extended time of worship and communion, rather like we've just had. And I, very grumpy teenager, if the band were about here, I was kind of where parish refill is at the back, as far away as I could possibly be from the action. And I remember sitting at the back, feeling very sullen, very grumpy, not wanting to go there, very miserable. And I suddenly became aware of this presence with me. I felt like there was a hand on my shoulder. And I had this inescapable feeling that I was meeting with God. And I wanted to run away. I didn't want to face it. I didn't want to face myself. But I knew that I couldn't. I knew that this was real. And in that moment, I began to cry. And then this wise older woman came over to me. She laid a hand on me. And if you've been in church for too long, there are these people that we call charismatic people. And when they pray for you, they murmur under their breath in another language. And then they say in hushed tones, more, Lord, more. And there was a lot more. I didn't just cry, I wept. I mean, I full on floods of tears for about an hour. And then I went back to my little dorm room, and I read the whole of John's Gospel in one sitting, and I prayed. And I was like, God, I think this is you. And if it is you, then I think I kind of belong to you now. I didn't really understand what had happened, but I knew in some way that something in me had shifted, that this was a life-changing encounter. And when I turned 18, I went to university, and the first Sunday, I went to church for the first time. And basically, I mean, I'm training to be a vicar now, so they can't really get rid of me anymore. But it was that mountaintop experience, an encounter with the presence of God, that changed my life. And some of you might hear that story and think, yeah, there are moments in my life that I can relate to when I've had something similar. And some of you might think, oh, I've never had that kind of encounter. I haven't experienced that for myself. And that's okay. We're all different. We all meet with God in different ways. It might be tears, it might be a gentle whisper. But we worship a God who meets with us on the mountain, who wants to make himself known. God meets with us on the mountain. That is the first thing from this morning's passage. And the second thing is that the God who meets with us on the mountain also molds us on the mountain. God molds you on the mountain. And when I learned about Munros in 2023, they have their own language. You don't just climb a Munro, you bag them. And you continue to bag them as you do all 283. And the kind of people who bag Munros are the kind of people who are quite fit. You have to be fit to climb a mountain. Or to put it another way, in the process of mountaineering, you are transformed. And when I was thinking about this talk, I remembered someone telling me once that athletes train at altitude. So I was like, I wonder if that's true, and I looked it up. And apparently, 95% of all medal winners at the Olympic Games train at altitude. Mo Farah and Paula Radcliffe were famous that before a big race and a big competition, they would sleep in an altitude tent. That is a thing, apparently. And the reason that people like Mo Farah train at altitude and sleep in special tents is because of something called hypoxic exposure. And hypoxic exposure is when you're at high altitude, where there's less oxygen in the air. And you can train your body to function using less oxygen. It's not easy, But after a minimum, apparently, of 8 sessions, you can notice a change in your endurance levels in your body. With reduced oxygen, the body becomes more efficient, so that when you return to a normal environment with normal levels of oxygen, you are able to work at a much higher intensity. Because the body at altitude responds to less oxygen by producing new red blood cells. And those red blood cells mean more oxygen and more nutrients being pumped around the muscles and converted into energy. Oxygen efficiency means better heart and better lungs. And if you laid out the average healthy adult's lung span, it would cover the size of a tennis court. But if you took a top athlete's lungs, it would be a tennis court and a half. That's pretty cool. You might say they've been transfigured to have a greater capacity. God meets with us on the mountain, but God also molds us on the mountain to make us like spiritual mountaineers, to make us fit with an increased awareness of the presence of God and capacity to live out his calling, to have clearer vision of where God is at work and what he might be doing. The mountaintop experience is that moment of revelation where you are lifted up out of yourself to see things from God's perspective. Jesus is transfigured. He becomes whiter than white before Peter, James, and John. And Moses and Elijah are there as well. And I think what happens in that moment is that they get this glimpse of what God sees. Jesus as he truly is. Jesus not just a carpenter from Nazareth, but Jesus the Son of God. Completely beloved by God, bestowed with divine glory, like Moses, whose face shone. This is transcendent and glorious. Peter wrote later that he was an eyewitness to that majesty, and it changed him. And that mountaintop transcendent experience is not just the moment of revelation when we see clearly, but it's also the moment of revelation where we hear clearly as well. In verse 7, then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud. This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him. They hear clearly the heart of God and the direction of God. This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him. And here is the thing. When Peter came to write the book of 2 Peter in the New Testament, his chief eyewitness account of Jesus that he talks about is not feeding the 5,000. It's not raising Lazarus from the dead. It's not walking on water. It's not having a miraculous catch of fish. It's not the parable of the Good Samaritan or the parable of the farmer sowing seed. It's not even the crucifixion. It's audibly hearing the voice of God in a cloud of glory on top of a mountain. That is the standout moment to Peter that he looked back on as this moment of revelation. We were eyewitnesses of his majesty. We ourselves heard that voice that came from heaven when we were with him on the sacred mountain. And that is the moment. Like me, aged 17, and I couldn't stop crying. This is the encounter with the presence of God that molds and shapes Peter. A pivotal moment in the transformation of a slightly turbulent, emotionally unstable ex-fisherman into the rock and apostle who will lead the early church. God molds us on the mountain. He transforms our perspective and he commissions us. This is my son, listen to him. These frightened, unruly disciples will spend the rest of their lives living out that call. God meets with us on the mountain to mold us on the mountain. But, and there is a but, my third and final point, God did not make us for the mountain. As Christians, we sometimes long for that experience of the transcendent, to be lifted up out of ourselves. Something that will change our perspective. We long for that high in worship, hallelujah. We long for the sweetness of the presence of God. but God did not make us for the mountain. You know, I would love to hear the audible voice of God right now. If a glory cloud wants to come down and say, Amanda, I love you, that would be great. But hypoxic exposure is a short-term experience because mountaintop moments aren't meant to last. If we look at verse 8, it says, suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. Jesus, Peter, James, and John are right back where they were at the beginning, except everything has changed. And the question becomes, how will you live now? Will you take that increased spiritual capacity, those big lungs that you learned on the mountain, with you into the valley? Will you take bigger breaths before deeper risks for God? Will you venture more boldly? Will you step out in faith from what you've seen and heard? Will you live differently now? God uses the mountain to mold us and form us and train us, but he doesn't want to keep us there. The Christian writer Oswald Chambers puts it like this. He says this, we have all experienced times of exaltation on the mountain, when we have seen things from God's perspective and have wanted to stay there. But God will never allow us to stay there. The true test of our spiritual life is in exhibiting the power to descend from the mountain. If we only have the power to go up, something is wrong. It is a wonderful thing to be on the mountain with God, but a person only gets there so he may later go down and lift up others. We are not made for the mountains, for sunrises, or for the other beautiful attractions in life. Those are simply intended to be moments of inspiration. We are made for the valley and the ordinary things of life, and that is where we have to prove our stamina and our strength. The mountaintop is not meant to teach us anything. It is meant to make us something. God molds us on the mountain to equip us for the valley. And that was true for Jesus as well. Even the Son of God needed this moment. This is the second time in Jesus' life where he hears the voice of God speaking words of affirmation over him, both at seminal moments for Jesus. The first time was at his baptism with John the Baptist, and after he is baptized, the voice of God comes down and there's a dove, and you can read about that in Mark chapter 1. But this is the second time. And when we get to the second time, John the Baptist, who'd prepared the way, has died. And so the way to the cross has been prepared. After this point, Jesus knows exactly where he's going. And I wonder if Jesus needed that moment to keep on going. And in verses 9 to 12, as they come down the mountain, the disciples don't really understand what's happened and how it relates to the future. But when they looked back, I think they would have understood. They needed this moment, and Jesus needed this moment. Each time before Jesus steps out in obedience to answer the call of God on his life, God affirms him. This is my son whom I love. And in this instance, he also speaks to the disciples, and I think he also speaks to us. This is my son, listen to him. You're going to need that with what's coming. God knows what we need to hear, and he knows when we need to hear it. God molds us on the mountain to equip us for the valley. It was true for Jesus, and it was true for the disciples. Peter, the leader of the early church, is eventually martyred. James was also killed around 44 AD, and John was exiled to an island called Patmos. But famously, he is the John who writes that he was the one whom Jesus loved. He knew who he was. These guys, they didn't stay on the mountain any more than Jesus did. But I think they needed that mountaintop experience to mold them and transform them into the kind of people who could see with God's perspective, with lungs that could breathe deeply in the presence of God, so that they could generously breathe out the love of God to all those whom they encountered, wherever they found themselves in the valley. And we need that too. We need perspectives that align with God. We need eyes that can see and ears that can hear. God did not make you for the mountain, but God will mold you on the mountain. God will meet with you on the mountain, and God will send you out again into the valley. And what we're going to do now is what we always do at Ascension. We're going to worship and we're going to pray. But can I encourage us as a church family to use this time to breathe in the presence of God? I don't know what your valleys look like. I don't know what Monday morning looks like, but God does. And we have this time to take in deep breaths. We have this time to become spiritual mountaineers, if only for a morning. And God loves us. He knows us by name. He has sent his Son to die for us, and he has sent his Spirit to fill us.